Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session of the Climate Evaluation Conference, and to this special session, which is on climate investment funding. I'm really pleased to welcome you here and welcome our panelists. For those of you who tweet, let me remind you that the Twitter handle is hashtag Climate-Eval Conf, as in conference abbreviated. And then I would like to also let everybody know that we are webcasting and recording this session, which is great because then those who cannot be here can still follow the conversation and connect with us by other means. But it also means that for those of you here in the audience who will be asking questions, I would like you to go up to the microphone so that your questions get recorded, because even if we here in the room can hear you, those who are following on the webcast will not be able to do that. My name is Caroline Heider. I'm the Director General of the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank Group, and I'm really happy to be here and chair this particular panel with a colleague of mine, Ken Chomitz, and Rob Vandenberg, who is an old-time friend, and two other colleagues who I'll introduce in a second. But first, let me talk about what this conference is all about, or what this session of this conference is about. And it is a conference that is for evaluation practitioners, by evaluation practitioners, to really raise the bar, to improve, like, how do we do evaluation of climate change, climate adaptation, all these complex questions. But it is also a conference that aims to inform policymakers about what do we learn from evaluation, how do we take this forward. And this particular session is specifically about that aspect, where we want to present a couple of evaluations that have been done, and then say, like, so what does this mean for decision makers? And this is particularly important at this point in time, because there is next month a conference in Lima. There's going to be conferences next year. The aim is really to raise a lot of resources for this very important question. And obviously, being evaluators, we want not just resources to be raised, but these resources to be put to the best possible use. We are looking at a significant body of work on climate finance experience and 3 recently completed major evaluations. And this session will give us the opportunity to compare those experiences and draw these lessons. So let me come to the panelists, and I will start actually with Dorte Verner. She's the principal economist at the Inter-American Development Bank's Independent Evaluation Office, OVE, and she's managed an independent evaluation of the Inter-American Development Bank's climate change activities. And previous to that, she was the climate change coordinator for the MENA region at the World Bank, so another World Bank colleague, and led the major report on adaptation to a changing climate in the Arab countries. Very important. Thank you very much for being here, Dorte. Next to her is Mark Wagner. He's the Senior Vice President of ICF International, and he was the team leader of the independent evaluation of the climate investment funds. This was an evaluation that was managed by a evaluation management group composed of the regional development banks and IEG. And we commissioned the ICF, let me not get the acronyms confused, ICF International, to conduct the evaluation. And so this is the evaluation Mark will actually present and speak about. Next to him, we have Rob Vandenberg, who is actually such a known quantity, I think I don't even need to introduce him. He has been for 10 years the director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the GEF, and is now let me read this, a visiting fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and obviously he's the president of IDEAS, the International Development Evaluation Society. or association, sorry. And then finally, last but not least, Ken Chomitz on my side. He is a senior advisor in IEG. We've been working together for a number of years, ever since I've joined IEG, and he's led for us 3 major climate-related evaluations, and he was the, what was your title on the CIF evaluation? The mastermind? He was basically running the management group for that evaluation, and was very involved and very knowledgeable about that evaluation. So what we're going to do today is we'll have 2 presentations. Ken and Mark will speak about the evaluation experience at hand. And then we will have actually a bit of a panel discussion where these 3 gentlemen and the lady will be responding to questions, and we're trying to make this a little bit more interactive so that it's engaging, that it's interesting for you. And we hope to have 30 minutes for questions and answers at the end, and we would then invite you to really participate in that. So with that, let me invite Ken to give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. So could we cue up the presentation, please? No? Yes? Is the presentation visible? I don't see it yet. So I'll just begin. Are we on the case? Okay. Well, I'll extemporize. So this session is about climate finance, but what is climate finance anyway? The new climate economy report, which just came out and we heard about yesterday, came up with a big number. $100 trillion of investment is needed just in energy and urban infrastructure by 2030 in order to put the world on a path not only of development but also of keeping climate change under control. That breaks down to about $90 trillion in a business as usual case, plus another 10 or 13 trillion dollars in incremental investment. But don't imagine that it's $90 trillion of coal plants and freeways and then a thin icing of solar panels. No, we have to change the entire $100 trillion of investment. So that's a big order. But so what have we learned about how to do this? As evaluators, do we have anything to contribute? Well, in fact, as Carolyn mentioned, we're very fortunate because this is not an entirely new agenda. The MDBs, the countries of the world, have been working on this for a while, and we're fortunate now to have a growing body of evidence, an evaluation of the climate investment funds, an evaluation that was just presented yesterday of climate activity at the IDB, the GEF OPS5 that we heard about this morning, and a series of evaluations at the World Bank that can begin to give us some insight into these issues. So let me outline four general themes that cut across the issue of climate finance, and we'll try to weave these, I think, into our discussion. I'll give some examples of findings on these themes from our evaluations at the World Bank Group. Mark will add some reflections from the CIF evaluation, and then we'll discuss more generally. So here are the four themes. The first is leverage and efficiency. You'll notice that everyone these days is talking about leverage and transformation. The World Bank Group has adopted the notion of transformation. The GCF talks about paradigm change. Transformation is integral to the CIFs. The GEF talks about catalytic impacts. And what's going on here was eloquently expressed by Andrew Steer the other day. The truth is that our resources, the international resources, are just a drop in the bucket compared to the $100 trillion that I just mentioned. So everyone is focused on, well, how do we get the most impact possible out of the the relatively small resources, the tens of billions. How do you use that to affect the tens of trillions? And that leads us immediately to the second theme. Second theme is the private sector, because if the public sector is only going to put in a few billion and the private sector is going to put in 100 trillion, what are the knobs and levers that we can use to affect how the private sector behaves, to shift it from its dirty past to a clean and gleaming future? The third general theme is governance and organization. What are the rules? What are the procedures by which all this money is raised? Who decides how to allocate it? Who comes up with the plans, the priorities? How is equity and efficiency balanced in these activities? And finally, the role of feedback and learning, monitoring and evaluation. How does this promote this entire enterprise? Let me query and ask whether we have a presentation yet. Okay. Well, I'll continue. So, some aspects of leverage and efficiency. The most basic is efficiency at the project level, cost effectiveness at the project level. We're investing in things that we hope will bring development, poverty alleviation, but also will mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. What's the most efficient way to do that? We've got many choices. We can invest in off-grid solar panels. We can invest in bus rapid transit systems. We can invest in energy efficiency. What do we know about where's the best place to put our money, or what's the best portfolio we could create? Well, this should be a straightforward exercise for evaluators. But it turns out there hasn't been as much effort as we need to have. What we tried to do at IEG is assemble information from appraisal reports on the effectiveness. Think about two dimensions of effectiveness: how much carbon emissions you get per dollar, and how much economic impact you get per dollar. It turns out when you do this kind of comparison, what immediately emerges is that many kinds of energy efficiency investments dominate renewable energy investments on both dimensions. They give you far more economic bang for the buck and far more greenhouse gas reduction bang for the buck. So the question is this true? Because there haven't been enough ex post evaluations to really firm this up. And if it is true, why are we not shifting the balance a little bit more towards energy efficiency rather than renewable energy? Here we go. Sorry, give me a second. The second route to transformation, and it echoes what we heard this morning in Rob's presentation, is this idea of demonstration that leads to replication and widespread take-up. So one route to this is this idea that if you demonstrate something, other people will pick it up and replicate it. And one finding that I think resonates across all the evaluations is that this can be a very powerful means of promoting development and climate change mitigation and adaptation. But it only works if there was a thought at the very beginning, in the design phase, about what are we trying to demonstrate, how are you going to demonstrate it, who are you demonstrating it to, how will they pick it up. And so I was going to illustrate a couple of contrasting examples in China. One project was called the Energy Conservation Project. This project tried to introduce a completely novel idea to China, the idea of the energy service company, which is a combined engineer and financier of retrofits, energy efficiency retrofits. And this was designed from the start with 3 pilot companies that would have open doors so that other people could come in and see how they were working out how to do this activity in a novel economic and regulatory environment. It was wildly successful. The market for energy service companies in China is now in the billions of dollars per year. In contrast, there was another very well-motivated project called what was it called? The Efficient Boiler Project. This looked at China, this was 20 years ago when they first conceived it, and they said, this place is full of these terrible, inefficient, polluting boilers. Let's just buy some patents for modern boilers, give them to some private companies in China. They'll produce them. Other people will replicate it, and the place will be much cleaner. Well, it turned out that private companies did not, in fact, want to share their proprietary technology. So that just didn't work. It was a failure of the theory of the change from the very beginning. So, moving on now, let's talk about how to engage the private sector. One of the main ideas about how to engage the private sector that's been in the climate finance world for 15 years now is the idea of carbon markets. And it's a simple and elegant idea. The idea is that many renewable energy investments are simply not profitable enough to investors who might look, let's say, for a 15% rate of return on their money. So the idea is, well, let's reward them for their benefits to the global climate. We'll give them carbon credits. That will give an extra revenue stream that will make the investment more profitable, and they'll switch over from dirty to clean investments. So again, this makes a lot of sense a priori, but when we analyze the finances of World Bank-related carbon finance projects, we found that at the carbon prices that prevailed during the last decade, about $8 or $10 per ton, it just wasn't enough to make any significant difference in the rate of return. The rate of return might bump from 14% to 14.3%. It didn't plausibly make a difference. What we did find made a difference is something that directly addressed the problem of these investors, which is that they have to raise a lot of money up front. And so we found that longer loan tenors, longer loan terms, was very important in giving them debt service that they could handle and really help to stimulate investments, the kind of investments that we want to see. So the next topic is governance. Let me give just one or two examples of governance. One is in this idea of mainstreaming climate adaptation at the national level. There have now been a few long-running projects which have tried to do this for a period of 10 years or more. And so we looked at projects in Colombia, in the Caribbean, and in the Pacific island of Kiribati. And we came up with a couple of basic conclusions. First of all, there was a tendency of these projects to spread themselves too thin. There are so many different adaptation challenges, and we found that when they tried to tackle too many challenges in too many places, given limited capacity, it didn't work. The second is that there was a notion that you could do a lot of planning first, and then when the planning was perfect, you could do implementation. And again, that didn't seem to work. People like better a cycle of little planning, a little implementation, back to the planning, a more iterative style. And finally, I guess I want to turn to this issue of learning and feedback. And here I want to present the idea that the monitoring and evaluation is not just some nice little add-on. It's something that you have to do, that donors have to do just to satisfy accountability requirements, but rather that it can be actually at the core of attacking the climate challenge. So the example I want to give comes from a World Bank project, World Bank/SIF project, called the Efficient Appliances Project in Mexico. This is a big project. This is something like $300 million of donor aid, $230 million of government investment, $170 million of private investment. $700 million project. It had a perfectly sensible premise, which is that a lot of households have very inefficient refrigerators and air conditioners. These consume an awful lot of electricity. Let's give people vouchers. We'll buy up their old inefficient appliances. We'll scrap them so that nobody else uses them, and we'll replace them with shiny, new, efficient ones. So this makes a tremendous amount of sense. Here we are. This makes a tremendous amount of sense. But what happened in fact? Well, there was an independent impact evaluation that was done by some impact evaluators in Berkeley. They weren't associated with the project, but they were able to get electricity consumption records from millions of households that participated in the project, and were able to do a quasi-experimental analysis, matching those who participated in the program with similar households that did not. And they found two things. First, they found, if you look at the left-hand side of this diagram, I'm not sure how legible it is. This is the month-by-month impact of participating in the program on the refrigerator side. And what it shows is a modest reduction in electricity consumption, about 10 kilowatt hours per month lower for the participants than the non-participants. That was about 1/4 of what the project designers had anticipated. On the right, you see a different story for air conditioners. If you look at the summer months, you find that people who participated in the program, who got the highly efficient air conditioners, consumed much more electricity than the people who didn't participate in the program. Now, we can come up with a number of theories on why this is true, but it's a really important finding, especially when people are considering replicating this project, spending perhaps another $700 million replicating it in Mexico or elsewhere. It points to the absolute importance of understanding what's going on here. Is it a targeting problem? Is it the wrong kind of vouchers? Is it simply because when air conditioning is cheaper, people run the air conditioner longer? Essential to find out these questions, and it points to the huge returns from building good monitoring and evaluation into the programs. Now, it turns out that not all donors and funders have got this message, but we sincerely hope they do, and I'm sure that when they get the message, the people in this room will rise to the challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken.
I also have a presentation which hopefully will, as Ken's did, come on during the last slide. So anyway, I have the honor of presenting our recently completed evaluation of the climate investment funds. And my first slide shows the organization of the evaluation process, which was actually very interesting, but there we go. So just by way of overview, we had this evaluation oversight committee, and as was pointed out, Ken was the mastermind. And then we we got information from the trust fund committee members. They asked the evaluation oversight committee to do this work. And then, of course, we're the evaluation team. So this is just by way of showing the institutional relationship, which I think is important from a methodological standpoint, but as Ken and Caroline have pointed out, we're looking at sort of more of the policy type implications during this process. But at any rate, just for your record. Now, we had for our evaluation approach and the terms of reference that were designed for this to look at two parts. One was to look at the CIF effectiveness, and the other was to look at documenting lessons for the eventual Green Climate Fund. And we were doing that by looking at organizational effectiveness, governance, management, and efficiency, as well as at the operational level, development and climate effectiveness. And as we'll point out, the CIF is a relatively new institution beginning in around 2009. So there aren't a lot of results on the ground, but we tried to look at what the design of programs and projects and the early experience on the ground looked like. We visited 13 programs in 10 countries, some of which had 2. That's an interesting point. If you look at climate investment, the CIF is a piloting program. So they do work in clean technology, small-scale renewable energy, pilot program for climate resilience, adaptation-related work, and then the forest investment program. If they only do 1 or potentially 2 of these programs in each country, obviously to look at the full picture of climate investment, you would need to be doing more than that in all of the countries, not just the 48, but now growing to more countries that are in the pilot program. So to now skip over and focusing on the four themes that Ken has mentioned that we're trying to focus, the sort of cross-cutting issues for this analysis, I want to just give a little overview of like what was working well. We have a balanced representation of recipient countries and contributor countries. There's very good transparency and disclosure. Obviously, there's $8 billion in funding, which is a substantial amount. They're investing at scale. Ken mentioned the one project in Mexico with $700 million, but if you look across all of the Mexico initiatives on climate finance in the clean technology arena, which is where those programs were, they have $500 billion from the CIFs and about $5.5 billion in co-financing from the World Bank, from the IDB, from the country government, and private sector. So with a $6 billion investment in clean technology, including wind, geothermal, and other resources, you can start to make a difference. So investing at scale is important. They also are an organizational learning institution, and we'll get to that later on. That's working well with the CIF partnership meetings and some of the pilot country learning opportunities. Those things are moving in a good direction in terms of engagement of stakeholders, institutional strengthening, capacity building, and creating this opportunity for real country ownership, which leads to good results on the ground. We also found that there was good cooperation. The MDBs previously sort of thought of each other as competitors, but through this CIF experiment, they actually worked together in a lot of cases, and some of that was evident in some of our observations, even at the trust fund committee meetings when the trust fund or the board would bring up some issue about that related to the MDBs, you would immediately see them all hunkering together and coming up with a joint response, as opposed to previously where they might be a little sort of territorial. So this is a good way forward, and I think it's starting to be taken up in some of the normal interactions on non-CIF projects, for example. There's some things that could have worked better. There was slowness in sort of taking strategic decisions. There was an excitement about getting projects implemented and out the door, but some of the results frameworks hadn't been set up in advance. And how are they going to handle certain initiatives, bringing on new countries, bringing on folks to help in the CIF administrative unit? A variety of things were sort of slow. The technical review procedures were sometimes ad hoc, sometimes not effective because of the timing, or whether or not they were actually contributing expertise above what the banks had already done in their programming. Some of the stakeholder engagements for some of the strategic climate fund initiatives and the FIP and the PPCR in particular were somewhat slow, and stakeholders may have felt left out. But again, this is a learning institution, it's a piloting institution, and they're trying to develop lessons learned and best practices to move forward. We'll get to this replication and transformation issue in a moment, but at the sort of strategic level, it's like definitions for transformation, for example, were either not available at the very beginning or changed over time, and so you had some programs that were set up with one definition of transformation, and then it was found to be suboptimal, and they changed some of the ways that they were going to assess that, and then you have new projects coming on with a different set of criteria. And so there's some harmonization in that area that needs to take place, but again, it's trying to get things going in a good direction. As I pointed out, there's good collaboration between the MDBs at the sort of headquarters level, if you will, but some of that has been slow to sort of get on the ground in terms of coordination in country. There's also some intergovernmental, sometimes different ministries being hesitant to work with each other and so forth. So to get back to Ken's point about the organization, and to maybe compare a little bit here and give Rob an opportunity to contrast with what's happening with the GEF, the CIF-AU has always, it's been proactive. It's maintaining a lean administrative approach, so there's not a lot of staff and some hesitancy in the trust fund committee members to allow expansion of that staff. So while they're working to incorporate things like risk management, gender specialists, some of the other things, the project review was not institutionalized within the CIF administrative unit, but it's sort of been taken up sort of pro forma by the developed country representative to the trust fund committee meeting. And there were some issues with CTF investment guidelines, as I alluded to earlier. We have this issue about risk, the gender focus and the risk management. And so those are being taken up as we move forward. And that's part of what we were doing in our formative evaluation, was to look at what happened, why, and to see what the trajectory is. And as this is a rapidly evolving, complex institution, and as we were looking at issues, sometimes things that we would point out that were, coming up as evidence would then, at the next trust fund committee, there'd be a document even before we had. So it's just a rapidly evolving institution. And I think that's something to keep in mind. Climate finance is rapidly evolving. The institutions to address it are rapidly evolving. And so that's important to keep in mind. So now let's go move to the issue of transformation, which is another one of these cross-cutting issues that we were looking at. I have two examples here, and one is the Forest Investment Program. Sorry to focus on Mexico so much, but anyway. There's opportunities in the FIP program in Mexico for significant changes in rural development practices, innovative credit and financing facilities, and projects that are complementary. In Kazakhstan, there was a little bit less of that story. Some of the regulatory, and this is in the district heating project, which is part of the clean technology portfolio. In that case, the program was designed in such a way that it's a good demonstration. It's going to affect infrastructure, and it's going to provide local benefits. But they hadn't really looked at some of the enabling environment, the regulatory and policy structures in place. So it's not exactly necessarily going to lead to replication and uptake until some of these impediments are taken care of, and hopefully that's in process and will then be a lesson learned for replicating this in another environment. Another one of our cross-cutting themes is the private sector. Ken mentioned, the private sector will need to foot most of the bill for what moves forward in the new climate architecture. Some of the things that we identified in the CIF planning process was that it was primarily focused, and importantly, and deservedly so, working with the developing countries, with the recipient countries, to engage them and gain ownership, which needs to happen at the government level. But then maybe there's a little hesitancy to involve the private sector because they're sort of seen as the adversary potentially to the government, and as instead of a partner, which is what they should be. There was some in the original design documents for the CIF. There were lots of sort of intricate equity and debt financing approaches, which, because of this sort of general risk aversion, weren't really fully taken up. So some of the tools and instruments that would be quite innovative haven't quite made it to the forefront yet. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that this is, as I mentioned, it's a rapidly evolving institution, and the analysis that we did is probably about a year old, so some of these things may have moved forward, and maybe that will come up in the discussion. Some folks may be able to comment on that. So another aspect of engaging the private sector was this notion of, we'll engage the private sector, but there wasn't the capacity to do that. And so maybe take a step back, and you need to do some more training, how to engage the private sector. So in many cases, and that's also true in the special climate fund arena, where the FIP and the PPCR and the SREP are housed, there's more of this training and institutional strengthening that needs to take place, and so therefore realigning expectations when do you expect this transformation to take place and this uptake by the private sector? As far as investment plans are concerned, they're quite strong, and they show this government ownership, which is quite critical. They're aligned with the national planning strategies, which is another initiative that the GEF is trying to do as well. Coordination has been a little bit uneven in terms of promoting mainstreaming and this intergovernmental coordination that I alluded to previously, where there's a little bit of distrust perhaps. And consultation, which is an important part of establishing the programmatic approach, of getting this country ownership, of working with indigenous peoples, depending on what the subject matter is, making sure you're incorporating gender and these sorts of risk management and so forth, and trying to do all this very quickly. So some more planning is needed to sort of make sure that consultation process follows I think that was one lesson. You know, in certain countries, consultation has a very specific legal definition, and you have to follow the procedures, which means it takes time. Coordination may have been a better choice of words, but again, you have this issue of like, well, which terminology, what do we use? And so that's something that needs to be looked at moving forward. As far as learning and monitoring and evaluation, I think the SIF we found evidence to support this as well. It's just me thinking it. The SIF exhibit organizational learning as part of their underpinning. The pilot country meetings are well received for exchanging lessons and ideas and developing best practices and South-South coordination. Some of the learning is maybe a little too rosy looking, and so there needs to be more of a focus on learning from mistakes, which is an important part of a piloting program. As Ken was pointing out, sometimes you have a theory of change which doesn't pan out. So learn from that, move on, improve, change your direction, what have you. Rob mentioned in one of his presentations yesterday the fact that results on the ground were not what they expected because a hurricane had come along and destroyed the project. So, there's all these types of things that you have to learn and plan for as you move forward. The results frameworks for the SIFs started out as too complex and now have been scaled back to be sort of simplified, high level, looking at for information that countries are likely to have, and flexible. You have a few core indicators, and as time moves on, you collect more data and provide additional information. But it doesn't stop you from moving forward with the project. The other point that's potentially relevant for evaluators is what do you do at the next level of the SIF? There's no provision for a summative evaluation of the SIFs or for looking at things at the national level, cutting across programs, or at the thematic level across countries. So those are some other issues that sort of speak to the next wave of what will happen with the SIF and are applicable for what will happen with the Green Climate Fund into the future. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. In this conversation now, we want to really draw out what are the messages for policymakers, because there's been a lot of conversations about us evaluators, and we know why this is important. Ken has given great examples of what data and information tells you to make better decisions, but if we really want to get some traction and make a change with all of these valuable, really important evaluation lessons, how do we make that? How do we get the messages to stick? And here I want to first start with the discussions about the organizational effectiveness and how do we manage actually climate funds. And Rob, in your role at the GEF, and you've done several overall performance studies, you've seen how the GEF has worked, and you just heard Mark say, well, the SIFs have worked on a very, very different model. How would you compare this, and what would you say were the key strengths from the GEF side? And we'll have Mark actually comment and sort of contest a little bit what we hear, because these are two very different models, and there are lessons to be learned, for example, for the Green Climate Fund.
Thank you. Yes, just testing whether the microphone worked. The GF and the CIFs are indeed difficult to compare because they are rather different organizations. Different in age, for example, different in the way they were set up, different in their linkages to the conventions, different in the portfolio that they have, different in the range of activities. And I think actually these bring possibilities, and they bring advantages to the GEF, and they bring difficulties to the GEF. I mean, it's basically, and also they point to some of the difficulties that the CIF is facing. So it would have been actually very interesting to do a kind of a comparative exercise and to look at the portfolios of the two and compare where they are particularly successful and where they have difficulties. One of the issues is, for example, the range of the modalities that the organization can actually fund. In the case of the GF, it's going from small grants to huge investments. Usually the huge investments, the involvement of the GF is rather small, but nevertheless, the GF is then leveraging money or supporting that these investments take place. And this wide range actually makes it possible to better serve countries, one could argue. But this could be a hypothesis, because different problems ask for different solutions at different levels. And what we've started seeing in the GF is that, for example, the small grants program tackles some of the issues of, for example, private sector engagement at a local level that huge investment programs can't tackle. And this is then integrated into activities. And we're currently doing, or the GF Evaluation Office is currently doing, an evaluation of the small grants program and is trying to identify issues like that. How do these small grants program interact with the larger portfolio in the country? Where is this actually leading to better results? So the range of support is wider, and this creates possibilities to, especially in countries where funding is a problem, where the public money is not sufficient, where initial pushes are needed on several issues. This wider range may offer opportunities. So that would be a first hypothesis that could be tested.
So if I ask you, Mark, when you hear this about the wide range of activities, the wide range of issues covered, are there lessons from the CIF where you say, like, well, they actually deal with similar things, and here are some of the ways that how they've addressed those?
Well, I think one thing that's important to point out is that the first comment that Rob made, which is the age of the institution. And many of the learning processes and fits and starts that the CIF is going through now, the GEF went through 10, 15 years ago. And developing. So
are they repeating the same mistakes, or is there some way that they can, and when we think of the GCF now, the new institution, will it have to go through the same learning cycle? Is that just how institutions grow up and have to stumble over the same issues?
I would say yes, that to some degree when you're setting up complex organizations, deciding who the partners are, trying to create communication channels, developing these complex approaches, PDF documents, PIN documents, what are you going to even call them? It starts to be, it's difficult. So I would say some of it's unavoidable, that there's just a learning curve, just like in any process. But I would also say that in some ways that the CIF were set up as a way to get around some of the things that were specifically identified as stalling points, if you will, within the GEF. For example, the CIFs work directly with the multilateral development banks, and the idea there was that they would potentially be working with stronger ministries and more directly with the countries through the processes that the banks already had. They avoid the UN process, which is sort of a fairness, equity, and the sort of complicated process in itself, and they're doing a piloting program. So then when you take those two things and sort of try to coalesce them into something, well, how's that going to work for the GCF? The main message that I come up with is it's complex. And you're going to expand to all the countries. You're going to do these programs across all 4 sectors, well, at least in many countries, or some countries. And then you have to engage the UN process as well. So those are all complex.
There and actually pass on the baton to Dorte. So you're working with the Inter-American Development Bank. You're an implementing or executing agency, depending on how that's defined. Actually, the GEF implements through the Inter-American Development. The CIF does. Any sort of lessons that come out from your evaluation that sort of like takes it from the perspective of that agency?
I think it's a very good question, thanks. I think the MDBs and many organizations, be it bilateral or NGOs, they're struggling where to put the climate change unit. Do we need to have a unit? Do we mainstream? How do we do this? And we have seen, for example, at the World Bank, they started in the environment, then it became a unit division, and now it's cross-cutting outside what you would sort of call sustainable development infrastructure department. And in IDB, it's the same thing. It started as an initiative, then it became a unit. That's where it is now. And we just launched our evaluation yesterday. Took it to the board, and our first message is exactly on mainstreaming. We need to strengthen the mainstreaming. And I think most organizations, we could say this. And how to do that sort of depends on the different kind of instrument that the institution has. But one thing that's very clear, and I think most of the development bank at least, they are not going across the board. They have focused very much on the heavy, obvious sustainable development parts, sectors, meaning energy, transport, agriculture, and things like that. Private sector, too. But we have forgotten the social protection that can build a lot of resilience and is really there. Health has not been big, even that there's many reports where both the IPCC and UNDP and others have documented the health impact, but the MDBs are not going there. We all know that in tourism it's very important. Nobody's really talking too much about that either. So yes, it's a big issue, both for funds, but also for big banks.
Yeah. So let me take this up, because you put this sort of like from like where the funding sources come to like how the institutions actually are organized. Ken, at the World Bank Group, how well is environment mainstreamed? And is there something that we learn from our evaluations, how well environmental and climate change questions are actually addressed across the board?
Well, I think this mainstreaming problem is a perennial one. The bank has struggled with it, as have others. The problem being that if you have a separate group that's responsible for environment and climate change, then they're sort of not at the direct face of action. Whereas if you mainstream them, then they tend to get swallowed up and ignored. The way that the bank has dealt with climate issues and mainstreaming historically has been to divide it into two buckets. There's the so-called win-win things that you're supposed to do because you'll benefit. They're cheaper than what you would do anyway, and they're good for the climate as a bonus. And then there's the other stuff which is good for the global environment but might cost you a little more, and that's why we set up this elaborate apparatus of concessional funds to do the top off. And it's been problematic. So with the mainstreaming stuff, For instance, one thing we harp on a lot is the relative neglect of energy efficiency. Energy efficiency just isn't charismatic enough either for a donor, which depends on lending large sums of money in order to keep the lights on, or for the recipients who like to be able to point to something concrete like a big windmill rather than something abstract like a demand management system. In that respect, actually, the GEF funds have been very useful because they've given the bank the ability to do things for free for the clients and to some extent pay for the tasking time to do projects that are small and they're therefore otherwise unattractive, but could have big impact.
Mm-hmm. Let me stop you there because I know you are passionate about this and you could go on longer, but we wanted actually to also come to the private sector engagement and can you termed it sort of like can the dirty past become a gleaming future? And so the questions, but then also Mark, you talked about, well, you know, the multilateral organizations, we are public sector and somewhat in nature, even though we're here in the IFC, this is more the private sector wing. How good are we as institutions to actually deal with the private sector and how do we engage with them? What's the experience at the Inter-American Development Bank?
It's mixed, with very short answer. But there's some good and some bad examples. Let's just step back for a second and look at what is the private sector they can bring to the table? They bring innovative goods and services. And what does the government bring? They bring certainty, enabling environment, and please don't bring uncertainty, because that's something that the private sector really do not like. I think we saw it all with the financial crisis in Spain, with the renewable energy subsidies. When they took them away, there was a lot of wobbling. And what we're seeing in the IDB is that the projects have been financed in energy. For example, in Uruguay, it's probably the best example. When the private sector work hand in hand in electricity reform, for example, together with the public sector arm of the IDB, it worked really well because there's harmony, it continued going ahead. For example, the finance free wind farms. And not only did the private sector provide the finance there, but because the government had a plan and they want to be probably the biggest wind energy producer by next year, overtaking my country, Denmark. And so it both gave them finance, but it also creating this market. Because the government have said they want to go there to be so big, and it seemed to work. Mexico IDB was less, sorry for the Mexico example. In Mexico, it worked less well. Mainly because the private sector didn't work with the public sector arm. They went in and financed a couple of wind parks. It's a bit problematic, both because of social, environment, safeguards issues, and the whole financing, the whole buying back, things that have already been paid for, now it's paid for again. It's a little bit of a mess, and it's not going. One of them is not even running. So it's mixed. But this was the mitigation part. The adaptation and private sector is, I think it's a little bit of a different animal. The private sector, they will adopt when it's needed within the years of the project cycle that they're responsible for. But they won't necessarily tell you and I, because I think we can treat it a little bit as a private good. Why would I show my competitors what I'm doing? And I think it's a little bit difficult, and I don't think IFC have done some excellent work on it, but I don't think we can really get a good understanding because we can't get the information.
Yeah. This is a really, I mean, I liked how you illustrated where the public and the private sector work really well together. They have a shared interest. They're very distinct roles. But that there are challenges. And so let me turn to Mark and ask you a really provocative question. And that is, how much is it in the interest for the private sector to get this right on the climate side? Are they really committed, and what's the platform? You've spoken in your presentation about how difficult it is for institutions like ours to actually be agile and be responsive and be sort of on top of that agenda. But on the private sector side, are they there? Are they going to come to the table and do what's necessary?
Well, I think at some level there's a willingness or an interest, because there's an investment to be made and profit to be made, then certainly. And I can give an example from the Montreal Protocol arena, where the private sector, you could just say, the fluid manufacturers, the people that made the CFCs and the HCFCs and now the HFCs, they're going to be phasing out the HFCs, which are technically not covered under the Montreal Protocol, but the next generation of fluids are available. And so there's a familiarity, there's a way to engage. And I think that's what's often missing is, as this rapidly evolving process is taking place, where do they fit in? How do we align their investment planning schedule, which is like 6 months, with a process that can take several years? And then when you're identifying something at the planning process, at the programmatic level, you don't have any projects per se. And when you get down to the project level, even if you had someone that's from the private sector that was engaged at that level, by the time you get down to the project, that entity is no longer around, or it's something that they're not interested in. And so there's this mismatch in timing as well as interest, which somehow needs to be addressed.
Yeah. So let me ask Rob then, when you think of it and think of this whole issue that Ken started out with leveraging the funding, and that we as institutions have limited funds, but we need to leverage and get sort of the private sector to come up. How would you see, how can we overcome the challenges that we just spoke about? The institutions running on a different tier and a different track than the private sector. What would be your recommendation? How would we do that better?
Well, I think first of all you need to recognize that the private sector does not exist. There are many private sectors. There are parts of the private sector that have commercial interests in certain activities, and they'll oppose you. They'll actually fight against you. And there are other parts of the private sector that indeed are taking initiatives that are going in the right direction. So it's not just only a question of leveraging, it's also a question of creating the right circumstances in which the right kind of initiative can bloom, so to say. And it struck me that if you look at the GEF successes in this regard, it's where we helped and supported governments to create an enabling environment for the private sector that this kind of leveraging effect took place. And it's actually what they want. If you look at the most recent G8 reports on impact investing and social and environmental impact investing, which brings together a group of the private sector that are interested to achieve more than just profit, but profit for society and profit for the environment as well, they are saying in their reports, the reports came out in September, so they're very recent, they are saying, we can actually mobilize 1 trillion for you. But then you, governments, you need to create enabling environments that will help us do this. So we don't ask anything else. We don't ask money from you. We don't need money. The leveraging that you can do vis-a-vis us is create enabling environments where we can do this, where we can do this impact investing. Mm-hmm. And I think they're right.
Let me add on that a bit. I think that there have been a dominant approach or a common approach to engaging the private sector has been to create a pot of concessional money and look for kind of retail opportunity. Here's some money. Do you have anything interesting you can do with this money? And so there are individually valuable projects. We retrofit an old coal boiler here or there. But it doesn't reach at this transformative impact. So one way to do that is exactly getting the environment right, and particularly removing energy subsidies, which get in the way of everything. Couple of other directions. When we actually criticized the IFC for being too retail-oriented, one of the things we pointed to is now taking place. Too early to evaluate, but the IFC has a program on building efficiency where they're working to promote standards and techniques for identifying high-efficiency buildings, and then helping to fund investments in the manufacturers and creating mortgage environments that give discounts to people who invest in these buildings. So that's something that goes beyond the retail level and gives you a sense of how you might have a big impact.
Great. I think all of the panelists would love to speak for much longer, but I would like also to give you a little bit of an opportunity to ask questions. So this is the time. We have 2 microphones up here. And so please step up to the microphone, and if you can identify yourself, ask your questions. The panelists would be very keen and eager to respond. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I was very grateful to Rob to make this comment that the private sector is not the private sector. The private sector also is not always fast. So of course, maybe DuPont has a product development cycle of a half year, but a German car manufacturer has a product development cycle of 7 years. That's actually longer than the GF project cycle. So there's no such thing as the private sector. And I love what Ken said about this standard, the EDGE certificate, because that's one point where you can actually get the private sector at the point where they claim that they are the best. You can create competitive environments. So you can actually have the producers and the supply chain to these energy efficient buildings compete for a high level standard that is the IFC standard for energy efficient buildings, which might carry, if it's designed properly, a real kind of high-grade quality stamp and also be good for the environment. So I really like that, and I think we should look for these new type approaches, taking the private sector where it has its edge, which is competition. I personally have very bad experiences with this enabling environment kind of thing. Yes, it's good for climate finance because we can give climate finance to governments and then they can create the enabling environments. But I personally was asked when I was sitting at a similar panel by a representative from Uganda and said, we have been doing all of that. We have created an enabling environment. We're ranked highest in investment certainty everywhere, but still we don't have investment in Uganda at that time. So even if you have an enabling environment, that's no guarantee that anything will happen in your country. So much for that. And please give me more ideas, like not only the labels. So I'm challenging you and the audience. One thing that I would ask Mark, and when he said that the private sector in financial instruments were not fully developed in the CIFs, is that because the pressure to get the money out the door was too high to take time to develop these products? And that brings me to the question, are we just fascinated with like large numbers? Is the CIF great because it's so much money? And again, I was very grateful to Rob highlighting that there is value also in small amounts of climate finance. So I would ask the panel to comment on this question of, do we need big numbers or do we need more quality in what we do? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points and some questions. But we can take a couple more questions before we return to the panel. Is there anybody else?
Hi, my name is Dima Rita. I work with the Adaptation Fund. I actually had a very simple, one question for Rob and Mark, I think. You started talking a little bit about the conventions and the fact that the CIFs aren't under the convention, whereas the JAF, we at the Adaptation Fund are, the GCF is as well, and what the advantages and disadvantages of those are. If you could just articulate those a little bit more, and if they came out at all in the evaluation as well. Thank you.
We have a third question? Yes, please, here in the front, and then there's some gentlemen also in the middle.
Hi, my name is Ramay Deshpande, former World Bank staff. I had the opportunity to do more than $1 billion projects in the bank. My question to the panel is, are we very ambitious or very optimistic about expectations? I mean, basically we should, before we end up with a story of half glass full, we should say whether we were expecting too much to have a glass to be full. So there is always this, we come to independent evaluation, they end up with half glass empty story. And the real question is as somebody said about enabling environment, that when we do the project, I don't think there is enough priority or adequate emphasis given on creating an enabling environment for that project. And that's why this problem of half glass full comes in. I think I will appreciate if panel could comment on that.
All right. And we'll take one more question, and then we'll throw this back to the panel.
Yes, Carl Schultz with the Higher Ground Foundation. I'm almost certain I'm asking too much, but can you pose this challenge of 100 trillion, and that's just on the mitigation side? So we're dealing with 3-digit trillion plus requirements, and I'm hearing a lot of important and useful things about transformation and trying to shift everything over, but I'm just wondering to what extent the evaluations of both the Jeff and yours have looked at the big picture. How are your initiatives going towards this much higher goal? Because we're failing, right? I mean, we're making nice little incremental movements while emissions and global concentrations are going up faster than that, aren't we? So that's just a question. I know it's asking maybe too much, but...
Okay, let me throw this back to the panelist. Dorte, are we expecting too much? And then are the initiatives going in the right direction?
If somebody had said to me 5 years, 2 years ago even, if we would be seeing more than $20 billion being issued in green bonds a year before the big deal, hopefully, I would have said, no way. Yeah, that actually happened in less than a year. $20 billion in green bonds. We're seeing the private sector or the big multilateral really stepping up. Palm oil, what Unilever have done in the certification basically made sure that for the majority, there's no more deforestation in tropical forests. Working with the NGOs, WWF, to monitor this is not happening. I think it's fantastic. And getting back to what I said before on the subsidies, there's news coming out on solar panel investments in Latin America just this week, saying that we are investing in Latin America because there is no subsidies. So there's no uncertainty. We know what we're getting into. The market have grown 70% this year. It's likely to triple next year. That's why we're there.
Good. Mark, two very specific questions to you. Financial instruments in the SIF, did they not develop because we were under time pressure? And are we just fascinated by large numbers, or is small is beautiful holds true still?
Well, let me address the one about the financial instruments first. In the design of the SIFs, the architects of the trust fund committee members at the time wanted to. So in the foundational documents, there are all these types of instruments that never got utilized. In part, some say because there was no desire to use those particular instruments, but later on in the process, there was a risk aversion. So that anything that was dealing with debt or equity or even capital, it just didn't happen. And so there was some downward pressure on those types of instruments, which may have been taken up to some greater degree if they had been available, but that's still a question. So I think the question is still out on that. And again, it's sort of to the point about engaging the private sector. If no one's coming forward, is it because they're not interested in those instruments, or because the process is too difficult? It's not quite clear at this point. In terms of big numbers, I think that's really the point, is to try to do something at scale. And if you're able to make an investment in a country that's with financing or leveraging, and those two things should be, co-financing and leveraging are not the same thing. But if you can make a $6 billion investment in Mexico or $2 billion investment in South Africa, you can actually accomplish something. Now compare, even if you take $100 billion, which is the purported size of the Green Climate Fund, that's 0.1% of this $100 trillion. So there's always the argument that, like, can you really make a difference with this level of investing? And it's not until you get this sort of catalytic effect of getting private funds in the door that any of this is really going to take off. But some of the investments and the direction that things are going, corporate social responsibility, green revolving funds, there's a whole variety of things that are being taken up that have nothing to do with these types of institutions.
Rob, the question about conventions. Is it good to be in or is it better to be out? What do you think?
I think it's good to be in. Actually, we found that GF support in countries was more relevant to these countries because of the fact that it follows convention guidance. Because these conventions are obligations that the countries have voluntarily signed up to. So, in other words, rather than to see an activity as something that a donor is pushing onto the country, where the country more or less says, okay, well, if you want this, it's okay, and you give us the money, so it's free of charge. So that this is an obligation, and it has to be met. And this leads to more ownership potentially. But we haven't done the comparison with some of the others. But
what about the disadvantages about being in the convention?
The disadvantages are especially there if the convention goes into micromanaging. So if the convention is saying, oh, the world should be like this, and basically identify details of how countries should tackle certain problems, rather than to leaving it to the countries. And funnily enough, we've seen this happening more in the non-political conventions rather than the political conventions. So climate change, huge political fights. So they're busy fighting over the 1 trillion and the 2 trillion and we're not getting enough money and so on. And so they're forgetting about the details. We need to have GHG emission overviews and so on. We need to know what's happening. But you find out, you report to us. The Biodiversity Convention, which is everybody is in agreement. We need to do something about biodiversity loss. So they start to become technical and saying we need to manage our biodiversity like this, and we need to do it so. And this very detailed technical guidance sometimes is then a hindrance because it's not really applicable in certain situations. Nobody has thought this through, and some of it is not consistent.
How about the consensus finding in this type of mechanism? Is that something where we have a difference between, say, a shareholder-owned institution and a UN setup? How the participation and the engagement is, and Mark, you spoke about that in your presentation. If you want to come back,
I can talk to a little bit about that. I think that let me sort of start with a positive example, or maybe it's not a positive example, but it's the same outcome. So whether you have a trust fund committee that's working somewhat on consensus and develops a results framework that has 37 indicators, or whether you're developing a terms of reference for or reviewing some project that's going to be implemented under the GEF through the council, if you get into the micromanagement is I think the key, and it can happen in either institution. But then if you're layering on other micromanagement opportunities like UN organizations so I think it's the same kind of management process that you need to look at, but it's at what level is it?
Okay, now let me turn to Ken. There was a question to you, the 100 trillion, and are we really getting, or how the question was framed, how are the initiatives going towards the higher goals? Are we seeing the progress? Are you as positive as Dorte is?
Yeah, I mean, to get to the big goal, it's not going to be done in one swoop. Political action is going to be part of it. Maybe the one exception is that Lockheed Martin says that by 2020 they're going to have a fusion reactor that fits in the back of your truck that generates 100 megawatts. And if they do that, then we can all go home. It solves development. It solves climate. But barring that, everyone agrees that we're going to have to work on hundreds of different margins, and it takes a while to figure out each one of those margins. What are we going to do, and then how are we going to scale it up? This gets to the big money question. So the question is, how do you use big money efficiently in ways that the private sector won't? One way is to nurture innovations, figure out the ones that are working, and then feed them and build them up. One possible example that might be a good example, or it might turn out to be a white elephant, is that the bank through the SIFs is putting about $1 billion into concentrated solar power. That's the kind of which certainly the private sector wouldn't invest in right now because it's not profitable. But it could be that this concentrated effort in a bunch of different plants that can learn from one another is going to help move that technology to competitiveness, which would make a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Rob is dying to jump in.
Yes, and
Rob has always the last word.
Well, we still owe an answer to Christine Verlen, who raised the issue of if you create an enabling environment, there is no guarantee that something will happen. I think actually Ken gave an example of how you could potentially tackle that, but I would actually like to refer back to Christine's own work, which basically showed there are many blockades against market development that are not of the market itself, but also not of the enabling environment. So indeed, issues like proven technologies that can be taken up, or funding, if the banks are not aware that something is a good opportunity, you may create the enabling environment, but the private sector will not get the loans to invest in this. So, I mean, it's not just the enabling environment. These other issues are extremely important. I wanted to support this.
Excellent. I think we have come to the end of this session. Is there any other burning question that we should be squeezing in? Yes, there is another question. Please go ahead.
I am Romeo Santos. I chaired a session a while ago. Spending the $100 trillion and let's say that we spend around 2% or even less of this for the development of evaluation. Do you think we would be in the position to say that we could address the big methodological gap that we have in the evaluation field? I mean, the things that we come to know, even starting yesterday, is that there's a glaring fact that we lack this methodology in determining whether this climate change mitigation or even adaptation projects and the evaluation that we do would help us determine the reduction of these greenhouse gases. There's complaint of this evidence gap, nonlinear causal path, for instance. Even if we are able to develop innovative, brilliant ideas, for instance, financial instruments, PPPs, impact investments, determining, assessing efficiency and so on. But we cannot safely say that these projects are leading to reduction of greenhouse gases. I don't think that would mean a lot, and that would put our work as evaluators, I think, at risk.
I think this is an excellent question, and I'm going to... there's another question. All right.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Donald Singh. I work for the Climate Change Secretariat in Bonn. I have a question to the panel. I think Dorte mentioned that it's not easy to allocate the climate change unit at the IDB because you don't know because of the cross-cutting nature of climate change. And one of the findings that we've made is that it's not easy to define climate finance because of different tailored approach at the different institutions. So I wanted to ask you, as evaluators, is it possible to have a common approach on defining climate finance, and how would you address that? Thank you.
Excellent two questions that we can combine. So how do we approach methodology for evaluating climate change? What is is there a common approach to climate finance? And most importantly, really, how do our evaluations really make a difference? And that has something to do with the methodology. Can we think about methodologies that will really help evaluations move the needle and show that as a result of an evaluation there will be a change? Let me start with Ken. Let you go this way around now.
So I think what we need is to combine the monitoring and evaluation in a way, integrate it with operations in a way that we don't see. Right now, we often see there's a management system that tracks expenditures. There's a results system that generates numbers for us people with the green eye shades, and the people who generate those numbers don't care about it. And then us people with the green eye shades look at these numbers and say, that's not what we wanted to know, and we go out and try to do an evaluation without the proper information. There's no need for that. We should be generating the information that's needed for management in ways that you can make real-time feedback and improvement and decision support, and then evaluators can come in at any time and draw these broader lessons.
Mm-hmm. Rob?
Well, on measurement of climate change, I would say that there is actually quite a lot of consensus on how this should be done. It may not always be applicable in the precise circumstances that you are looking at or that an intervention is focusing on, but there is huge development in methodology on how to measure temperatures, how to measure GHG emission reductions, and so on. The second issue is then, do we have agreement on how to assess funding proposals for this, and how to come up with climate funds that could tackle this? And I think, again, there is quite a lot of agreement on important issues, but the communities may not always connect to each other. So I mentioned the G8 group on impact investing. They propose a different set of criteria than has been used so far in the banks. And so there needs to be a discussion about this. I think it is a crucial issue, and it needs to be picked up.
Mark?
Well, I'd like to focus on the question about evaluation and methodologies. To me, the most important thing is whether you're at the site-specific monitoring, reporting, verification level, at the project M&E level, at the thematic level, at the programmatic level. The most important to recognize that there's differences in approaches and methodologies, and at those different levels, but also to have the sort of flexibility and the sort of outside-the-box thinking to design something based on the knowledge base, and that's why something like this evaluation conference is so important to our community of practice, to gain more knowledge about how to do these things, and recognize that there are differences in approaches and depending on what you're looking at, but being flexible and moving the process forward so that the next time you do an evaluation, you have better information, better approaches, more flexibility, more engagement between the evaluators and the practitioners, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Dorte?
I pretty much agree with all of you. This one little wrinkle on Rob's. I agree we all know what a thermometer is and how to measure temperature. I agree we can calculate the greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not sure we're there on how to look at climate change adaptation. I think good development policy and adaptation, it's a fine line. And then what is it that we should look for when we're doing evaluation? I think we need to look for results, but what is adaptation and what is good development? I don't think I understand it, at least at this point.
Terrific discussion. Thank you very much to the panelists. And many thanks to the audience. I have one request, and that is there is an evaluation of this conference, and you're invited to complete that. And as evaluators, we always do want to have some feedback and evaluate, even evaluation. And then the other announcement is there is a session planned right after this. There was originally in the program a half an hour break between these two sessions, but I've been told the organizers want to go on right away to the next session. So for those of you who are staying for that, please stay on, and the show will continue. But thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.